The Chinese authorities have taken tough action to try to suppress the widespread protests.
Across China, citizens and police clashing in the streets.
Really quite disconcerting was the youth unemployment figure.
In China, a new wave of young folks is shaking things up, and it's got the government scratching its head. The youth are feeling increasingly fed up, and this movement is being called Let It Rot, or Bailan.
That people have marched against the president and against the government, with protests spreading to some of China's biggest cities.
It's like a silent protest, but it's got a lot of power behind it. Unlike past protests that got squashed, this one is calm but enough to make the Chinese government quite anxious. Just a few weeks back, police were sent into big cities like Shanghai to break up gatherings, leading to some protesters being arrested and taken away.
Prompting thousands to protest Xi and his Communist Party while demanding freedom and denouncing censorship.
While there's no violence involved, this movement poses a real threat to China's economy. Usually, when things heat up with other countries, President Xi Jinping shows a tough front. But now, he's reaching out to the younger crowd, asking them to ease off and even trying to motivate them with some encouraging words. China is really struggling with youth unemployment right now, and it's not happening in a vacuum. There are a bunch of other economic issues piling up too. The real estate market is drowning in debt, which is definitely taking a toll on the economy. Plus, trade tensions with Western countries are creating even more uncertainty. Let's look at the numbers. The youth unemployment rate jumped from 13.2% in June to 17.1% in July. That's the highest it's been all year. This spike followed a change in how the government counts unemployment, which now excludes students from the figures. So while the number is pretty alarming, it might not tell the whole story because it mainly reflects data from cities, leaving out a lot of young people living in rural areas. Last June, youth unemployment hit a staggering 21.3%, but the Chinese government stopped releasing those numbers and switched up the way they calculate them. That move raised some eyebrows about how reliable the data is. The job crisis for young people is just one piece of a much bigger economic puzzle. The real estate market's debt crisis is looming large, and the ongoing trade disputes with the West are only making things worse. While the overall unemployment rate held steady at 5.2% in July, there was a slight rise in the jobless rate for folks aged 25 to 29, which went up from 6.4% in June to 6.5%. This just goes to show that the job market is getting tougher. On top of all that, China is facing another problem stemming from a choice made 44 years ago. There just aren't enough young people around. Even though it's the most populated country in the world, it's struggling to find workers for its businesses and military because the population is aging. So, what's got these Chinese teens and young adults so riled up? And what's this quiet rebellion doing that's causing such a stir for the country? The Chinese term Bailan, which translates to let it rot, really took off across the country in March 2022. On Weibo, it racked up over 91 million views in just 6 months. That's pretty impressive, especially considering how quickly China tends to shut down trends that could challenge the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. At first, the government probably thought it was just another passing fad. But what happened next was totally unexpected. By the way, I've noticed that my videos about China aren't getting as many likes as before. I suspect it's because the CCP's bots are trying to mess with things. If you could hit that like button right now, it would really help me out, especially for content like this. Thanks a bunch. Now back to Bailan. This movement captures how many young people feel these days. They've sort of thrown in the towel because they don't see any point in trying anymore. Lots of them have quit their jobs, drifted apart from their families, and stopped chasing success, opting instead to just live a normal life. Interestingly, this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. In 2021, another popular term was tangping, which means lying flat. But how did things get to this point in China? The frustration behind Bailan has been simmering for quite a while, even though the music video didn't drop until 2022. It's the outcome of years of certain strategies in China. For instance, New Oriental Education, which started on November 16, 1993, became such a successful private educational services company that it grew to be the largest private school provider in China. It even made its debut on the New York Stock Exchange in 2006 and later on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in 2020. Back in the 90s, private tutoring was all the rage, and companies like New Oriental exploded in growth, even going public to sell shares. By 2004, before New Oriental even listed its shares, they estimated that China's education market was worth around 580 billion RMB, which is about $72 billion. The tutoring industry was thriving, creating loads of job opportunities. At one point, it was estimated to employ around 10 million people. But there's a saying, once employed. The whole world was stunned when China made a massive move in 2021. It basically wiped out the entire tutoring industry. This decision wiped out billions in market value, leaving many people jobless as major teaching companies saw their worth plunge by 80 to 90%. It shattered an industry that was worth a whopping $100 billion. So, what happened? In July 2021, the Chinese government launched a serious crackdown on the tutoring sector, turning everything upside down. Suddenly, tutoring companies weren't allowed to teach core school subjects for money, hold classes during school hours, raise funds, or even list on the stock market. The aim was to ease the pressure on students, but it ended up costing countless jobs. Take New Oriental Education, for example. Its value plummeted by 83% in just 10 months. In that same period, many other tutoring firms lost nearly 90% of their market value, forcing them to let go of 40 to 50% of their employees. In total, around 206,000 people lost their jobs just from the top 7 tutoring companies, not counting the smaller businesses or regular classes. But this wasn't just about tutoring. Since 2021, China has also tightened the screws on the tech and real estate sectors. By 2022, it was clear something was amiss. Alibaba, the giant in e-commerce, had to lay off over 10,000 workers, while Country Garden, one of the leading real estate firms, let go of about 30,000 employees. Now picture a mother who relies on tutoring to support her family, a recent college grad who lands a job at one of these now defunct companies, or the founders who poured their hearts into building these businesses only to see them collapse almost overnight. If you were an entrepreneur in this environment, would you feel inspired to start a new venture? Probably not, considering your hard work could vanish in a flash. It's the same for workers. Now they're left with a cloud of fear and uncertainty hanging over them. This deep-seated anger is a major force driving the uprising among China's youth, but it's not the only thing fueling this growing movement. China gained its independence in 1949, but it started off in dire poverty. By 1990, a staggering 66.3% of the population lived in poverty, and millions suffered from hunger. Back then, China's GDP per person was a mere $90. Fast forward 50 years, and something incredible happened. By 2022, the GDP per person skyrocketed by 141 times to 12,620. That's right, 141 times. With a GDP of $7.9 trillion, China is now the world's second largest economy, and the poverty rate dropped dramatically from 66.3% in 1990 to just 0.3% in 2018. During those tough times, older generations worked tirelessly, establishing a work culture that persists today. The infamous 996 work style, working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, has become the norm. Just to give you some perspective, the average work week around the globe is about 40 hours. In theory, China's labor laws say a normal workday should be 8 hours with a maximum of 44 hours a week. But in reality, most workers clock in nearly 28 hours more than that. The challenging job market in China plays a huge role in this. We'll dive into that soon. Many workers feel uncomfortable, even guilty, about leaving the office before 9 p.m., as it's become part of their work culture. This is what the younger generation in China is pushing back against. They've witnessed other ways of living and are eager to find something more balanced. Imagine grinding away for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, with no way out. Your health and relationships start to crumble because you just don't have the time or energy for anything else. Frustrating, right? That's the reality for many young people in China today. Even though they desperately want to escape this harsh work culture, most young folks in China feel trapped. The harsh truth is that China isn't really addressing this issue. In May, youth unemployment soared to a record 20.8%, up from 20.4% the previous month. In August 2023, the Chinese government reported that a shocking 21.3% of teenagers were without jobs. Instead of tackling the problem, the CCP decided to handle it the typical way. They stopped releasing the urban youth unemployment figures altogether. So, is the problem solved now? This is why so many young Chinese workers find themselves stuck in the grueling 996 hours. There simply aren't enough jobs to go around. It's a tough situation, and for many, quitting isn't an option. The competition for jobs is getting fiercer too. In 2021, around 9 million new graduates were expected from Chinese universities, and by 2024, that number is set to rise to 11.8 million. It's no surprise that there are more graduates than available jobs. Over 1 in 5 young workers in China are now unemployed. The high unemployment rate is partly due to the let it rot attitude, but it's also because there simply aren't enough jobs available. A Peking University economist pointed out that things are so grim that nearly half of Chinese youth might end up jobless. This includes those who choose to lie flat or opt out of the intense hustle culture altogether. With the job market being so tight, recent graduates are taking on some pretty odd and sometimes silly roles. For instance, there's this new trend where they're getting paid to be full-time kids, helping their parents with housework. Imagine handing your mom a bill and saying, "Hey mom, you owe me at least $500,000. It's a weird gig, but desperate times call for desperate measures. With a lack of jobs and constant pressure to get ahead, things aren't looking great for young people in China. It's truly shocking to see how tough things are for the youth in China through various case studies. Take Crystal Gua, for example. When she spoke to CNBC, this 30-year-old shared her story. The crackdown on the private tutoring industry hit her hard at first. After 6 months of searching, she finally landed a job at a real estate company, but her entire department was laid off a few months later. With jobs disappearing in the tech sector as well, Crystal decided to lie flat and escape the harsh reality. She started using hobbies and part-time gigs to pay her bills and keep herself busy. Millions of young Chinese people are turning to the Let It Rot movement as a way to cope with their tough circumstances. But it's not just stress that they're dealing with. In China, young folks face immense social pressure, often referred to as changlea, which means starting a family and finding a job, usually linked to buying a home. In China, owning an apartment is a sign of social status and a significant life achievement. The problem? Home prices have skyrocketed, making it almost impossible for the average young person to buy a place in major cities like Shanghai or Beijing. Currently, the average income in China is about 12 times the price of a home. This reality makes homeownership feel less like a dream and more like a financial trap. As young people in China witness these challenges, they're starting to push back. They're no longer succumbing to the societal pressure to own a home, especially when it's so unaffordable. All these factors, job scarcity, high societal expectations, and soaring property prices, are seriously hurting morale. Movements like Let It Rot and Lying Flat not only challenge Xi Jinping's vision of the Chinese dream, but are also impacting the economy. One clear sign of this effect is in worker productivity growth. It used to be around 7% per year, but since 2021 it has dropped to about 4%. That's a significant decline, highlighting how this youth rebellion is affecting the broader landscape in China. And there are plenty of other factors contributing to this situation, and we'll get into them later, but the rising unhappiness among Chinese youth is definitely a big part of it. You can see this in numbers like the decline in retail sales and consumer confidence in China. With the jobless rate so high, it's no surprise that young people are spending less. When many of them don't have jobs, they're just not buying as much. This drop in spending leads to reduced demand, prompting businesses to cut back on production. As a result, either more people lose their jobs or fewer new positions are created. It's a vicious cycle that makes the economy worse, unless the Chinese government steps in to do something about it. You might wonder, so what if people in China aren't buying much? They can still sell their goods to other countries, right? That sounds reasonable, but it's more complicated than that. Back in 1995, there were only 3 Chinese companies on the Fortune 500 list. Fast forward to 2023, and that number skyrocketed to a whopping 142, the highest of any country. That's impressive, But here's the catch. Most of these businesses, especially large state-owned enterprises, SOEs like the State Grid Corporation of China, China National Petroleum Corporation, and China Petrochemical Corporation, rely heavily on domestic sales. In 2018, over 85% of their revenue came from within China, and private companies are in a similar boat. So if the Chinese economy slows down, it could hit these businesses hard and leave them vulnerable to competition from abroad. And you can already see signs of this slowdown on the horizon. Believe it or not, China isn't just experiencing a slowdown. It's also facing deflation. That's right. While the rest of the world is grappling with inflation, China is seeing prices drop. In July, prices fell for the first time in over 2 years, marking the fastest rate of decline in 15 years. You might think, isn't it great that things are getting cheaper? But deflation can be a sign of more serious problems in the economy. When supply increases but demand doesn't keep up, prices drop. Conversely, if demand goes up but supply can't keep pace, prices also decline. In simple terms, China is experiencing deflation because demand has taken a nosedive. Businesses and people aren't spending money like they used to. Despite being the second largest economy in the world, China is struggling to boost demand. What makes things even tougher is that no other major economy is dealing with deflation right now. Less demand leads to lower production, which means fewer jobs and more unhappy people. China is facing an even bigger challenge that overshadows everything else, like the economy, jobs, or GDP. This issue is a demographic time bomb, and it's been a significant concern for many countries around the globe. So here's the scoop. China has a massive population of 1.4 billion, and a staggering 280 million of those people are over the age of 60. That's almost 20%. China now has the largest elderly population in the world. While countries like Japan, South Korea, and Italy are grappling with similar issues, China's situation is a bit unique. Many nations are dealing with low birth rates due to the high costs of raising kids. However, China's problem stems from government policies. The infamous one-child policy, introduced in 1980, had a huge impact on the population. Back in 1949, there were about 540 million people in China. That number had jumped to 969 million by 1980. But agricultural production couldn't keep pace with this rapid growth, leading to food shortages. To prevent a potential hunger crisis, the government implemented the one-child policy to curb population growth. Fast forward several years, and that same policy has turned into a significant issue. The birth control measures have created a situation where there aren't enough young people to support the aging population. By 2035, it's predicted that around 400 million people will be over 60, making up nearly 30% of the total population. That's almost as many people as currently live in Japan, South Korea, Italy, Canada, and Russia combined. On top of that, the policy skewed the male-to-female ratio. In fact, there are about 35 million more men than women in China, leading to various social and cultural challenges, including intense competition for marriage, just like in the job market. You might think that fewer young people could mean better opportunities for those who are around, but it's not that simple. A shrinking population can lead to a host of complications. For example, Japan saw its population decrease by 20,000 people in 2008, but by 2023 that decline had increased to over 830,000. Japan's Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, even referred to this demographic trend as the country's gravest crisis. Research shows that as the working-age population shrinks, so do business profits, which can hurt the economy over time. Workers are also the primary consumers, so with fewer workers comes less spending. Japan's experience serves as a cautionary tale for China, which is now facing similar challenges as its elderly population grows and the number of young workers declines. Japan's spending has taken a bit of a nosedive because there just aren't as many working-age folks around. This drop has had a major impact on businesses too. Just look at the Fortune 500 list. Back in 2000, there were 107 Japanese companies making the cut, but fast forward to 2023, and that number has plummeted to only 41. That's a whopping 60% drop. There's a strong connection between the number of working-age people And the number of Japanese companies, about 94% of the time, they go hand in hand. Let's chat about birth rates for a second. In the groovy 60s and 70s, Japan's birth rate was around 2. Now it's just 1.3. Experts say we need a birth rate of 2.1 to keep the population steady. And guess what? This decline in birth rates is also linked to Japan's GDP growth, which has been crawling along at just 6% per year between 2015 and 2023. By 2029, it's expected to drop even further to 4.5%. South Korea is in the same boat with a birth rate of about 1.1 and GDP growth slowing down from 2.5% to 2.0% over the next few years. Japan and South Korea aren't alone in this. Plenty of other countries are also facing shrinking populations. Even though these places have seen some rapid growth in the past, they could have enjoyed even more if their population numbers had stayed up. So why is having younger people around so important? Well, for starters, when there are fewer people, there's less demand for goods and services, which can slow the economy down. A dropping population affects the economy in two big ways. Fewer people means less demand for stuff, leading to falling prices. Hello? Deflation? When prices drop too low, the economy can really take a hit, which is something China is dealing with right now. On the flip side, fewer people also means less work is getting done, resulting in fewer goods produced. With fewer folks around, there's less need for all sorts of things, be it products, services, or even housing. So if the population keeps falling, it could spell trouble for the housing market too. It gets even trickier. As more people retire, there are fewer workers to support them. This creates a real imbalance. The government ends up collecting less tax money while shelling out more for pensions and retirement benefits. So what's China doing about this? They figured out that their one-child policy wasn't the best idea and scrapped it in 2016, allowing families to have 2 kids. While the fertility rate did rise from 1.67 in 2016 to 1.69 in 2021, it's still not enough to keep the population stable. Then in August 2021, they upped it to 3 kids per family. But even after that change, the birth rate only climbed to 1.7%, which was a far cry from what they were hoping for. The reasons are pretty similar to what's going on in Japan and Korea. Many folks are anxious about whether they can afford to raise more children. Plus, years of being told that one child is the way to go has made a lot of people think that's still the best option. Things might have looked a lot different if China hadn't stuck with the one-child policy for so long, or had at least considered a 2-child policy earlier on. This policy didn't just hurt China's birth rate, it also had some serious implications for the military too.